This is so we had a brief history on taxes earlier. In the Mexican-American War, Colonel Kearny marched into Santa Fe, 1846, and he wrote the first American tax code for Santa Fe. It was interesting. This was a bloodless battle. About half of the Mexican army that was here stayed because they saw the American dream, which was interesting. The other half marched away, and Colonel Kearny had a tax code written. It's 21 sentences long. Now, he was using a pill and a quill and parchment, and so it was bigger than this, but 21 sentences long. And there's some interesting parts in here. First of all, he apparently had a problem with billiard tables because he charged $60 a year for billiard tables. $50 a year if you were going to make whiskey, but $60 if you were going to play pool. But let me just read section 20. Now, granted, one of these sentences is 80 words long, but it's still a sentence. There shall be levied on all goods, wares, and merchandises contained in the statements required to be made by the 16th section of this law an ad valorem tax of 1/4 of 1%. So a 1/4% gross receipts tax, 1846. We lived essentially under this law all the way through statehood. The very first New Mexico tax law is from 1915, and it's 21 pages long. So we went from 21 sentences to 21 pages. Okay. Now this one is all business tax. Okay. Some of the more interesting things in here is a peddler. If the peddler travel and carry his goods on foot, $5 for every period of 6 months. If one or more beasts of burden, $5 for every horse or beast of burden for a period of 6 months. If a cart or other land carriage, $8 for a period of every 6 months. So these were all business taxes. This is how we funded the territory of New Mexico. This tax is all personal property. So when I mean personal property, I don't mean just your house, your land, but your bed and your dining room table were also taxed. And how this worked was the legislature came together. We decided we needed $300 to run the state. And so we would send the tax bill out proportionately to the various counties, saying Bernalillo County needs to come up with 30 of those $300, and San Juan County needs to come up with 10 of those $300, or whatever the number is. And most of this is what the tax collector could not do. But they basically assigned a value. Okay, so dining room chairs, might be, we're going to tax dining room chairs at a penny a chair, and that's how we're going to collect the $300 for the state to run. And so that's what they did. 1915, Great Depression. People didn't have the money to pay their property taxes. And so they just started giving the tax collector their chairs and their tables and their beds because they couldn't pay. Well, the tax collector couldn't use that. Okay, we couldn't pay our staff or the state police with a bed, right? They needed cash. And so we came up with the emergency school tax, which is a gross receipts tax, which then we defined as gross receipts tax in 1966, which we just learned, right? So here you go. So now, where are we today? Well, we went from 21 sentences to 21 pages to 1,200 pages of microprint, okay? Most of us can't read that. You could read this one. You can't read this one. And this is what our current tax policy looks like. So we've talked about three-legged stool for some time in that we have a gross receipts tax, a personal income tax, and a corporate income tax. But we really have 5 major sources of income. We also have the investments. That's our permanent funds. And what I've labeled over here is energy, but that's really from the state land office. So it could be grazing fees on state land, but it's mostly from oil and gas fees. That's where the money comes from today. And this is what our tax stool looks like. If you were to take each one of these legs and it were a hollow cylinder, and you did, pi r squared times the length, and you would figure out what the volume of that was, and you just filled that up with tax revenue, this is what it looks like. Our corporate income tax is almost nothing. Our gross receipts tax is certainly the biggest leg. And the personal income tax is broken now because the one big beautiful bill did things to our personal income tax that we did not anticipate here. And so now when we look at our revenue, we tax things in New Mexico, personal income tax, that the feds say we tax. If they say it's not taxable, it's not taxable. And what happened was they said took some things off the table, and so this leg now is really broken. I don't know what to do with it. So there you go. So much for the props. This is the 2% tax bill. It's 196 pages long. But when all is said and done, you will see pages and pages and pages of repeal. And here's why. We have about 356 credits, exemptions, and deductions. 356. So earlier when we were talking about, a special tax or whatever, we also have about 100 other weird little taxes because we tax goods and services different than we tax insurance. We tax little cars different than we tax big trucks. We tax diesel fuel different than we tax gasoline. We tax beer different than we tax wine, which is different than we tax whiskey. We tax boxing differently than we tax betting, even though they might be the same thing. We tax corporations different than we tax people, and we tax people different than we tax other people. And so what we have here is a mass of confusion. And what I want to propose to you is that real tax reform is what we need. What we've heard earlier today, and the reason I brought up the food tax was because we've had several tax steps along the way that have been really significant. And the food tax, in my mind, was what really broke the gross receipts tax when we repealed that. Because prior to that, taxes were somewhere between 5 and 7%. The high counties were at 7. The low counties were at 5. That was the gross receipts tax, all encompassing. That was the city, the county, the state. And we said that taxing food was bad. And so this was all, do-gooder, hearts. And the problem that we did there is the poorest New Mexicans were not paying gross receipts tax on food anyway, because they were receiving SNAP benefits, and therefore they weren't paying tax on food. The poorest, okay? But in New Mexico, the poorest is like 40%. So the total population was on SNAP at the time. 50% now, almost. So what we did is we said we're not going to pay tax on food. They weren't paying tax on food. And then we effectively, even though there's this technical deal that Pam was trying to explain that, no, we didn't really raise it. We did this deduction. Okay. If you're in the store handing over cash to the cashier, it was a tax increase, whether we called it that or not. Okay. And so that 0.5% was initial. And then we raised it again because we had this hold harmless, because the hold harmless was for cities. Because when you took that tax off of the food, places like Bloomfield, New Mexico had one taxpayer, the grocery store. And all of a sudden, they didn't have any taxpayers. And so we were trying to hold Bloomfield. I know that because it's where I live, but there were, 100 other cities that were affected by this. But there are plenty of places that had only one taxpayer, the grocery store, and we took most of that tax away. So we tried to hold them harmless by giving them state money. And then we went broke as a state. And so that we said, oh, well, okay, you guys go ahead and raise your own taxes. And so effectively what we did is we took people that weren't paying tax on food and we increased their tax on everything else by up to 1.25 more points. Wow. The idea behind that, I think, was caring, compassionate, loving idea. Not a problem. But the effect of that was we really screwed up our tax system, because what we did over the course of all of this time is we put massive number of holes in there with 356 exemptions, credits, and deductions. I propose now that we fix it. Not by piddling around the edges, not by doing a little tax break over here, not by doing something over there, not by a tax rebate or a tax increase, but fix it. And that's what this 2% does. So it's pretty simple. It eliminates almost all of the 356 deductions, credits, and exemptions. So if there is a transaction, it's taxed at 2%, every transaction, but not a gift. So I could give my son $100 and that wouldn't be taxed. I could give my church $100, wouldn't be taxed. I could give anybody $100, that's not taxed. But if any one of those, if the nonprofit, if the church, if my son goes to the store and buys something, it's taxed. Everything is taxed. There are some big issues that are out there, though. So if we're going to tax food, even artichokes, we would tax at 2%. Of course, the people you're paying with SNAP still wouldn't pay that. So they then, get a tax cut. So the poorest get a tax cut. This isn't a 2% on top of what's out there. This is just 2%. But there are some other important things to think about here. What does that mean to the locals, to the cities and counties? Well, when we took it off of food, we practically bankrupted all of the small towns. But now they can tax food as well, because if the state can tax it, so can the locals. Everybody taxes it. And so this bill does not address what the locals can do. If Santa Fe wants 150% gross receipts tax on all of their stuff, boy, how'd he go for it, huh, Santa Fe, if that's what you think you need to do. But for most places, including Santa Fe, I think they would look at that and go, wait a minute, we now don't need a 3% tax on things. We could probably do this quite literally with a 0.5% tax if we're taxing everything. So the total tax burden on anybody in New Mexico would be about 2.5%. Now, it could still vary because we're not dictating in this bill what cities do. But they get to tax everything. Okay? So why do we want to do this? I believe that we need a sea change, S-E-A, a sea change in how we look at our taxes. First of all, it's got to be simple. Right now, it's complicated. Ernst & Young did a tax study on New Mexico. I think this was in 2019. And they said that we were by far the worst taxed state in the union, by far. And then we sent people to them and from TRD and from economic development said, look, but we got all these cool tax credits. We got all of these things that we can do. And so Ernst & Young, the largest CPA firm on the planet, needed to have our tax policy explained to them by our experts from our state. How can any business that's looking at coming to New Mexico deal with this? If Ernst & Young, the largest CPA firm on the planet, can't figure out our tax code. But after it was explained to them, we moved up to 33. So we went from 52, because we were worse than Puerto Rico or DC, okay, to 33 after it was explained to them. I don't think we're overtaxed. I think we're just grotesquely, confusingly taxed. We have 100 taxes and 350 exemptions. Wow. And people can't figure it out. And so when somebody wants to come here, they're thinking about coming here, what do? They hire the high-powered lobbyists. They put together this cool package. They come before us and they say, gosh, we're going to bring $1 billion worth of investment and 300 jobs, but you better give us a tax break first. And so we do it. And then their $1 billion and their 300 jobs turns into $150 in 2 jobs. And it never really turns out. It's almost never worked out since I've been here. So, first, it's got to be simple enough for us to understand. It still has to raise enough money. And interestingly enough, if we tax everything at 2%, I believe we raise the exact same amount of money we're raising today. This is not a tax cut to bring new businesses in. This isn't a tax increase. We're just making it simple, but it's the same amount of money. And our expert over here, Izzy, has been working diligently at this, trying to come up with a good FIR. And he will tell you that it's plus or minus $300 million because we don't know what the exemptions are. The big exemption is ag. We don't tax ag. We also don't know what they don't pay. We don't tax feed, and we don't tax seed, and we don't tax things that are processed here. And we don't know what that is either, economics. So that's why it could be more or less. Could be. But the idea is that it's revenue neutral, raises the same amount of money. It raises only the amount of money we need. No extra, but it's not cutting any programs either. But the most important part is it's attractive to the rest of the world. The rest of the world can look at it and go, wow, I understand New Mexico taxes. It's 2%. I don't need a herd of attorneys and CPAs to figure it out. It's 2%. I can go to New Mexico. I can play in that game because New Mexico is practically perfect in every way. And can you bring me the last little prop there? New Mexico is practically perfect in every way. We have practically perfect weather. We have practically perfect people. And if we do this, this is what 2% looks like if you use the same formula here and you put everything into this. We still have the investment income, and we still have the energy income, but then we have the personal income and the grocery sit all go into here. And if you have just a mere 10% gain in GDP, this is what the tax package looks like for New Mexico. And this is a stool that we can all use and sit on and actually make New Mexico stronger, because this isn't going to break like this one. This is real. And this is better than getting sugar nuts for Christmas.